Hello, we'll wait a few minutes for everyone to sign in and join. Thank you. We appreciate everyone's patience and we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to this virtual IA Symposium sponsored by the Office of Regional and Field Coordination within the Individual Assistance Division. We are excited today to talk about our vision for 2023, share housing information with you, and also provide an update to survivor experience. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Emily Rogers, who will go over some logistical information for our time together today. Emily?
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, my name is Emily Rogers, and I will be assisting Jennifer in facilitating this virtual symposium. Before we begin, I would like to share some information to help make for a smoother symposium experience. And please forgive my reading, but there are numerous details, and I want to make sure I get it right. This symposium is being interpreted into American Sign Language and will be captioned in English. Therefore, you will see an interpreter on the screen with the symposium speaker. If you require captioning in English, please click the closed captioning icon and enable captioning. As a result of the interpretation and captioning, please expect speakers to pause during their remarks, presentation, and the transition between speakers to allow our interpreters and captioners adequate time to rotate during the symposium. To ensure all features of today's symposium are accessible, we recommend using a laptop. All participants will be muted and will have video disabled. We will not be able to unmute any participants during this webinar. Please use the question and answer box to submit any questions for the facilitated question and answer portion of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and posted online at a later date. The recordings from the 2022 virtual symposiums have been posted on the FEMA YouTube channel. The links to these recordings will be shared in the chat. Throughout the symposium, we welcome your questions and comments. Please use the question and answer box to ask questions of our presenters. Questions that are not answered during today's symposium will be answered after the webinar and sent out to the person who has asked the question. If you prefer to communicate with FEMA's Individual Assistance Division outside of the question and answer box, we invite you to email us directly. Our staff will drop our email address in the chat now. Today's agenda and presentation will be uploaded to the chat. To view the materials, please select the link and download the materials. Jennifer, back to you.
Thanks, Emily. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our IA senior leadership team, led by our director, Frank Matranga, our deputy director, Dr. Elizabeth Ash, and then deputy director, Zachary Usher. Frank, over to you to share about IA's 2023 vision.
Well, good afternoon and hello to everyone throughout the country. If you are at home or at the office, I hope you're doing well and staying warm. If you are on the road helping disaster survivors, thank you to both you and your loved ones who are enabling you to be out there helping people and get some good sleep and eat well. There is a lot of work going on throughout the country, so it is great to virtually be able to see you all. My name is Frank Matranga, and as mentioned, I'm the Director of Individual Assistance here at FEMA. I am very excited to be here with you today and to talk a little bit about where we're going in 2023. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to introduce myself as well as the Deputy Directors of Individual Assistance, Dr. Elizabeth Ash and Zach Usher. All three of us have started since our last symposium, and I think I can speak for all of us when I say we're incredibly humbled and excited to be working with such a capable team at FEMA and such committed partners throughout the country, and very much looking forward to working with all of you. So before I tell you a little bit about myself, I wanted to let Liz and Zach introduce themselves. So for those who may not know them, so I'll turn it over to you, Liz.
All right, awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Ash. I'm the new Deputy Director for Program Delivery in Individual Assistance. I'm really happy to have joined this team and also to be here today with so many participants to hear about what our plans are for the future of IA and the great work that our team has done so far. I joined IA in November from the National Flood Insurance Program via Mission Support and OPM. So that's a little bit about me, and I will hand it off to my partner here who's having some technical difficulties, but here's Zach.
But my partner's got me covered. Thank you.
Of course, always.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Zach Usher. I serve as the Deputy Director for Business Operations in the Individual Assistance Division. I've worked in various roles in FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery for the last 10 years. Started my FEMA career about 19 years ago with FEMA Region 2 in New York, working in our mitigation and flood insurance programs. Like Liz, very excited to talk to you all today about our plans for the year ahead and how we plan to continue meeting the needs of disaster survivors. Thank you.
Great. So for those of you who I haven't met, Frank, I'm Frank. I started as the IA Division Director in October. I come to Individual Assistance by way of Public Assistance, where I've been the Deputy Director of Operations for the past couple of years. It is very exciting. The old Division Director, Chris Smith, and I, when we used to give briefings and 101s on recovery, we used to talk about individual assistance and public assistance as the two FEMA hands of recovery, able to help a community rebuild and hug and do all the great things that you can do with your hands. So it is very exciting to transition from one hand to another hand. And I can say I'm very excited to have gotten to know a bunch of you over the past couple months, to have had an opportunity to visit a couple field offices and see the great work that we're doing and where we're going. And I'm incredibly excited to be with you all and take on the leadership of this amazing team within FEMA and this amazing enterprise across the entire country. So with that, I think we can switch to talking about where we're going in 2023. Next slide. Great. So I think, obviously where you're going, partly depends on where we've been. And so, as mentioned, I started in October with the division here at FEMA. And I think, from a broad perspective, I've been able to view individual assistance as a partner over the past number of years. And when starting the job and reflecting on where we are, I hope you realize, and I hope each of you realize, how impressive what you have been able to accomplish, both over 2022, but also over the last couple of years, and it'll feed into where we're going. How impressive it's been. I remember talking to one team early when I onboarded, saying the economy of the United States looks very different without the individual assistance program having been able to deliver lost wages in COVID-19. The evacuation of Afghanistan and bringing all of our Afghanistan partners to the United States looks incredibly different if we as a program and we at FEMA didn't step up along with a bunch of our other partners and help figure out how do we bring those people into our country and fold them into our great nation. Funeral assistance, we have helped 178,000 families over the course of 2022 who are dealing with the worst of days. They had a loved one die of COVID-19, and we've helped provide them assistance to help them manage some of those expenses and put their loved ones to rest in a way that's respectful and celebrates the life they live. That is a tremendous place of strength. I come to this division not with a sense of we need to be doing things 100% differently and turn and do a 180. In fact, I come very much feeling the opposite, and I take on this role very much feeling the opposite, and that's we're doing great. We have an absolutely amazing mission, an incredibly impactful mission to help people after disasters, and we've got a great set of core values to be compassionate, to move with fairness, integrity, and respect. And those are what's going to guide us, kind of going forward. And when it comes to what do I want and how do I approach individual assistance, as a leader and as an individual, I think I would summarize where I want us to go as a program as what I think most of you whom I've talked to over the last 90 days and at field offices and regional offices, on the ground in communities with DSA teams. I want to figure out how do we help more people and do it quicker and better and more often. And that is, if I could put it as simple as possible, we have this amazing mission. It is to help people after a disaster. And where I'd like to take us is I want to figure out, how can we help more people? And that will never be something we're able to plant the flag in and say, mission accomplished, but always something that, we try to figure out how can we help more people and how can we help them quicker. So to talk a little bit about that, let's talk a little bit about kind of where we are. So next slide. So, in getting to know a lot of you and chatting with a lot of you over the past 90 days and visiting field offices, we have a unique challenge as a program. And what I would say is the wording is there on the slide of our recent successes have led to expanded expectations placed on programs already struggling to meet 21st century challenges. So I'll unpack that a little bit, but recent successes. So we've been doing incredibly well. And I don't say that as, just the person, responsible for some of this stuff now. I say that as you don't get asked to do more unless you are doing well. We as a program aren't looked to solve things like lost wages or to help with the border crisis if we aren't doing incredibly well. So we have, as a program and as a set of programs and as a team across the entire country, and not just FEMA, our partners as well, we've been doing an incredible job where folks have been looking to emergency managers and folks in disaster relief to take on more and more responsibility. That's kind of happened in this environment where expectations are expanding. If it's our programs and our structures were designed in the 70s and 80s, and the world is significantly different. We work in the world of housing. The housing problems of the country today are completely different than they were 40 years ago. The expectations of a survivor are completely different when you have a cell phone and have access to change everything in your life in an instant. We work with communities that if we're honest, the bonds of local community look differently than they did, a half a century ago. And so we really have, we have this place of evolving expectations where, the expectations that Americans encounter in their daily lives are things happen quickly and they're relatively simple and technologically oriented. That's being placed on us. And if we're being honest, I think we're already as programs, kind of struggling to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We're struggling to figure out, how do we grow in an environment where climate change is making it so, last week, the early January used to be the end of registering for assistance from hurricane season, and the past couple of years we're also now in early January being incredibly large response operations because we have tornadoes that are coming over the summer and then significant levels of flooding and fires that we've never seen before. The world's changing, and so the challenge we face as a team is we're doing really well, and those recent successes and the expanded expectations that are happening in the entire world, we're placing them on programs that we're struggling, to adjust to the scale and scope of a climate changed 21st century. And so we've got a lot of opportunity to figure out within that environment, how do we figure out how to help more people and do it in a quicker fashion? So where are we going? Well, in order to kind of, raise that challenge, we're going to do a couple things. So we'll go to the next slide. So I'll let Liz and Zach expand on these, but at a whole, we want to focus in kind of, three big areas. So first, we want to focus on supporting and growing our team. My perspective is it's not unique what we're trying to do is not unique. If you look at any good company, organization, whatever you business, church, when you want to serve people, part of how you do that is happy people is by supporting your team. Happy people lead to happy customers. You know, it's the business model of most good, high quality customer service organizations. And so we've got to focus, you know, within FEMA and within our broader team, you know, how are we supporting and growing our team so we can, you know, help and enable survivors to recover from disasters. We also, if we want to provide more help, we got to figure out how to do it more equitably. There are still historically underserved communities who we are not able to reach because if we are honest, our systems and our structures are reflective of historic challenges that don't enable us to reach all the communities who we need to and all the communities who need our help. And we also, quite honestly, have programs, and this isn't, you know, unique to individual assistance, but I in my prior life struggled with this a lot in public assistance, but we have programs that have a complexity that creates a barrier to entry for these underserved communities. So we got to work on, you know, that, and we're working on providing that help more equitably. You know, and then finally, all this, you know, both of those things are because we got to, you know, make this easier on survivors. If we want to help more people, we got to figure out how do we make it easier for them to access that help. And so we're going to focus a lot on improving the survivor experience as well. So I'll turn it over to Liz and Zach to talk about each of those, you know, in a little more holistically, but I wanted to emphasize that I think we are building on a foundation of great strength. And in my first 90 days, I have been incredibly impressed with the capability of each individual I've met, the orientation towards, you know, hey, we want to help people and figure out how we can help people, the ability to think outside the box, to be creative, to move quickly. I've been incredibly impressed with all of that. And so I want to thank you guys for what you've done to get us here. And more importantly, thank your families. Our families, you know, sacrifice a lot. That 2022, you know, all that we have accomplished, you know, it required a lot of nights on the road, a lot of late evenings picking up phones or looking at a computer screen. And that's your families and your support networks who are providing you a great deal of support. So I specifically want to thank them for helping get us here. And Liz and Zach will talk a little bit more about where we'll go over the next year. Liz?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. You'll see that our first priority is supporting and growing our team. For anything else, protecting and nurturing the health and well-being of our team, who are the people that are working so closely with disaster survivors every day, will be our primary focus. As Frank talked about, we have increased work demands given climate change and increased customer expectations. We're going to double down on efforts to provide emotional health and well-being resources. To that end, we will be partnering with FEMA's Office of the Chief Administrative Officer's Mental Health Branch to build out programming this year and training for IA staff in mental health, wellness, and trauma-informed communications.
Thanks, Liz. In addition to supporting the team, there's a need to, in some places, grow the team. So a real area of focus for the last 12 months and in the year ahead will be identifying and then taking actions to augment the resources at our regional offices, at our headquarters offices, so that we're better positioned to deliver the right people with the right skill sets when needed in disaster response. Part of the assessment of how we grow our team is also how we train and develop and resource our team. So other elements that we'll be looking at closely are how do we leverage technology and evolve the way we're delivering training to our current team and those that we'll bring on board, as well as our resourcing strategies, assessing for where we are at now, as Frank talked about the context of the programs, but where we're at now in terms of technology and society, and how we maximize the resourcing options that make sense for today and for the responses we will take on in the year ahead and beyond.
All right, our second priority area is to provide help more equitably. This describes how we provide help more equitably. You're going to be hearing in depth from Monty and Blair a little bit later about some of these things. So I'll just hit on a few high points here. We will streamline the speed of delivery of disaster case management to better coordinate the needs of our most underserved and vulnerable fellow Americans. We will implement recommendations from the Direct Housing Reimagined initiative and continue to pursue legislative, regulatory, and policy changes that ensure our programs bridge gaps and deliver more equitable outcomes. And we will reevaluate how we conduct inspections and other field operations to ensure that we are resourced efficiently to reach survivors who need our help the most.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm going to close with highlighting some of the areas of how we improve the survivor experiences, which is our very reason for being as an organization and individual assistance providing support to disaster survivors. Two areas in particular that I'll note is examining and reevaluating to improve the process by which we register disaster survivors for aid, for assistance. And looking to streamline and simplify that to try to identify where are there barriers to entry, as Frank noted, that we need to address to ensure that all those that need aid from FEMA and from the whole community can access that and do so in a reasonable and timely manner. And then from a sheltering perspective in particular, we've seen significant changes in approaches to sheltering pre and post disaster over the last 3 to 4 years. Some of that was driven by necessary adaptations to the threat from COVID-19. But what we're seeing is increased continued use of non-congregate sheltering. What that really means in plain English is things like commercial lodging, in addition to or to supplement more traditional congregate sheltering measures. So we know that there's work needed to examine both the policy parameters and also the implementation tools for non-congregate sheltering, which, as I noted, has become an important part of the emergency management toolkit to support disaster survivors. You'll hear more from Blair and Monty in a few minutes on other aspects of the survivor experience that we'll be looking to augment and improve in the year ahead. But those are a couple of additional highlights as well. So with that, I'll hand it back to Frank for a couple of final thoughts on the opening as we continue to talk about priorities for 2023. Frank?
Great. Thanks, Zach. So I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions. So I will turn it over to Jennifer and see if there are any questions.
So we do have a question about appeals. So a significant barrier with negative impact to the survivor experience is the frequency of denials and necessary appeals. Are you evaluating strategies for reducing the number of cases requiring appeals? And I know that Blair may touch on this a little bit in her presentation.
Yeah, so both Blair and Monty, when we talk about housing and enhanced applicant services, we'll talk a little bit about, I would frame this as, how do we communicate things to people in a way that enables their disaster recovery and doesn't add to the confusion and inadvertently kind of delay their disaster recovery? And I want to, kind of my perspective, new to individual assistance is this isn't the easiest thing in the world, right? We have these programs under the Stafford Act that have been designed, with good intention by Congress. But often, with competing priorities, and it's kind of an evolution of a program over, a number of decades, that kind of creates layers of complexity. And part of the challenge we have is how do we communicate that complexity in a way that, as I mentioned, enables survivors to continue on their road to recovery, and get answers to, hey, what support am I going to get from FEMA? And do it in a way that helps them do that, and not in a way that kind of they don't understand or they need help with. So Blair and Monty will talk a little bit about the details of some of the things we're doing, but I will and the priority list, in some way or another, gets at the broader issue here, which is how do you communicate things in a way that survivors understand it, both with an equity lens of, because if you don't do that at all, you're likely to leave behind, historically underserved communities, but also in just a, survivor experience sense of, it's frustrating if you have to deal with things that you don't understand. So I'll let Monty and Blair a little bit later get into the specifics, but I think that this will be an area where, you can see it in the priorities now. We're going to focus on it You'll see in IAPPG version 2.0, you know, a little bit of a movement from an appeals-oriented structure towards requests for information and then determinations. But I think that this will be an area of concentration for the next couple of years for us as we try to, you know, kind of streamline things and make them simple on survivors.
Thanks, Frank. We have a couple more questions that have come in. So, the next one is, how can there be more consistency of FEMA policies and programs across the regions? Seems as though there are different interpretations of the same policies. And if we want to take that for another time, some of the questions we will put in the final report and provide responses then. So move on to the next.
Well, I can, Jennifer, I'll take that a little bit. So
Sure.
I think, you know, first off, I want to, you know, my perspective is there's a truth to every disaster is unique. And so if the expectation is every single thing works the exact same way in every single disaster, that doesn't really mesh and blend with the industry we work in. You know, all crises are somewhat unique. You know, communities look different, their needs are different, and fundamentally our job is to provide federal assistance with our partners in a way that meets the underlying needs. So I don't look at disasters as it's really possible to have full levels of consistency. Where I come at consistency is it's important to be consistent about how you get there and not try to reinvent the wheel. What we bring to the table is we deal with crises and disasters every day. And so, you know, we don't need to retrain every new staff member at any new field office on how to do something. We should have, you know, good, robust policies that can expand any event, but that also that we're consistently implementing. So I think that, you know, it's a little bit of a catch-22 of, you know, there are people that would rather have the decisions look the same no matter what. And my perspective is they can't look the same no matter what, because the mattering what matters, because it's the needs we're trying to serve. And so sometimes, you know, a solution that may be approved in one event isn't going to be approved in another. And our job is to work with our partners and make those decisions as best we can with the facts we have.
Thanks, Frank. We'll have time for just one more question, and then we'll move on to our next presentation. Expediting case management program doesn't necessarily ensure deployment at the survival level. Both in New Jersey and Kentucky have approved funding, but no viable program after over a year since their disasters. How will FEMA support efficient implementation at the state level once a disaster case management program is approved?
Zach or Liz, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Thoughts, Frank? Yeah. I've got a couple of thoughts, Frank. So there are a number of things with the case management authority that FEMA was granted in 2006 that have been building over a number of years in terms of how FEMA supports that program. A couple of highlights that I would note are an effort over the last 4 years to significantly invest in the grants management expertise of our individual assistance staff. This was new. This was necessary because historically, FEMA individual assistance staff didn't play a significant role in managing grants that are governed by 2 CFR in sort of the traditional grant making role that some may be familiar with other forms of assistance. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've invested a substantial amount of funding to train multitudes of our IA staff members in grant program management so that they can provide technical assistance to the state as they stand up those programs. We recognize that there are 2 roles that from the federal side when it comes to administering grants. There's a program administration role as well as a financial administration role. Another thing we did over the last 4 years was unify at the regional level those functions. For a number of years, they were actually split, where the financial management and oversight of the case management program was done at the regional level. program oversight at headquarters. That was problematic because we heard from states, tribes, and territories that we weren't always seeing consistent interpretation of the program intent. So we've unified that at the regional level. We've also invested in training in order to upgrade our capabilities from a staff standpoint. Last thing I'll note is we continue to hire and recruit for deployable field staff at a senior level. For those that are with the agency, you know these as IM core positions, but those are positions that are intended to be field deployable nearly all of the year, about 70 to 80% of the calendar year, specifically for our community services programs to include disaster case management. And what we do see consistently is that field deployments of those staff with expertise to sit alongside a state or a tribe or a territory to conceptualize the program and then also work with them on program delivery consistently delivers better results. So we'll continue to invest in those areas of effort in addition to some other program upgrades and enhancements the team will be taking on with disaster case management over the next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. And we'll be going to our next section on updates in housing, and I'll have Emily introduce our next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am pleased to introduce Blair McDonald, Section Chief in FEMA's Individuals and Households Program, to provide information on current housing initiatives. Blair, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. As Emily said, I'm the Program Management Section Chief for the Individuals and Households Program within the Individual Assistance Division. And I know this is one topic that we have talked about previously on one of our symposiums. So one, this is to provide an update on where we are at with the Direct Housing Reimagine initiative, and also to talk through some next steps. Next slide, please. As most of you are aware, as part of our FEMA strategic priorities and our administrators' annual planning guidance, we were directed to develop recommendations for how we can evaluate and reimagine the direct housing program in order to meet survivor needs more effectively and consistently. As part of this effort, we went through kind of a 3-step process in order to do that evaluation and analysis of our direct housing program to truly reimagine what it could look like in the future. The first step of that was to gather information from stakeholders, all of you, as well as our survivors, and review past direct housing reviews that had been completed. The second part of that effort was to take all of that information from that outreach and develop short, mid, and long-term improvements to strengthen our existing program under our current authorities. So we didn't just want to look at reimagining, but we also wanted to evaluate, based on the feedback that we had received, recommendations to improve what we currently do, how we do it, and how we can do it more effectively under our current authorities. And then the third step was to then also take the recommendations that we had received and evaluate those for bold and cross-cutting actions so that we can develop a new strategy, potentially using new authorities for housing. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about the stakeholder feedback, over months of work and information sessions, listening sessions, survivor focus groups, we held 28 stakeholder group listening sessions. These were from everyone from local officials, states, NFIP partners, internal FEMA partners, external FEMA partners like congressional stakeholders, etc. We also had 10 survivor focus groups from different disasters that spanned from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. And we conducted various one-on-one interviews as well with some of our survivors. We reviewed 10 previous direct housing reviews that had been conducted since 2008 and the recommendations that came from all of those reviews. And all of those efforts resulted in 155 different recommendations. 66 of those were short-term, 35 were midterm, and 54 of those were long-term. And so that really started the basis of our review to look at the next step of this process, which is, are these recommendations for how we can change our current existing program, or are they recommendations to change our program completely, including some of the authorities that we have? Next slide. So for the second step, which is those short, mid, and long-term improvements to strengthen our existing program under our current authorities, I just included in here some of the recommendations that came out of that effort. Again, we had quite a few recommendations, and quite a few of those we are pursuing and continue to pursue. But some of the efforts that have resulted in those recommendations, I'll walk through a few of them today, but we have everything from proactively providing enhanced applicant services and casework to our survivors, implementing disaster case management sooner, shortening the direct housing implementation timeline and providing better planning for direct housing implementation, which includes establishing temporary direct housing implementation teams. A lot of recommendations around pre-event planning for states, tribes, and our territorial partners, as well as local governments, and how can we prioritize that planning, potentially in the future incentivize that planning, provide additional technical assistance, exercises, and training for our partners, and provide additional information and materials to outline the requirements for direct housing so that when states, tribes, territories are working with their local governments and communities, we're very clear about what the requirements are for direct housing implementation if and when requested and approved after a disaster. So I'm going to talk about a few of these initiatives today just to give you all an update, because these are improvements that we're making to strengthen our existing program under our current authorities. And so we have already started and in many cases implemented a lot of these recommendations. And so I'll walk through some of that with you. Next slide. The first one is enhanced applicant services. So this is really an effort that we began in Disaster 4633 Kentucky. And it was really focused effort to identify and assist a targeted population of applicants who have a need for the proactive assistance from FEMA, navigating the FEMA or recovery process, ensuring that they receive all the assistance that they're eligible for from FEMA, and then identifying any unmet needs or long-term needs that FEMA may not be able to assist with, and connecting them with voluntary agencies, other federal agencies, and our disaster case management program and partners. As part of this effort, we have implemented enhanced applicant services now in 5 separate disasters. And to date, we have made more than 67,000 additional call outs to assist these applicants. We will continue to build out the recommendations for enhanced applicant services to inform short-term and long-term recommendations as part of these efforts. But right now, the short-term approach that we are taking in order to implement this effort is establishing a separate field-based team that is solely focused on this casework and proactive outreach to applicants at the Joint Field Office. This dedicated group of individuals are made up of deployed applicant services reservists, and they receive separate specific casework training so that they understand and can evaluate the case from start to finish and really work with the applicants throughout their recovery by ensuring not only can they navigate that process as I outlined, but that they receive all the assistance that they're able and any additional referrals that may be needed. Next slide. The next effort that we have already started and actually seen some tremendous progress from, and I know this was one of the questions that came up in the chat, but evaluating ways and putting an established streamlined process in place to implement disaster case management sooner. So for the 2022 hurricane season, we implemented a modernized approach for states, tribes, and territorial governments to use when planning and implementing services under the Disaster Case Management Federal Grant Award. As part of this streamlined process, there was a new OMB approved application form and accompanying guidance that significantly reduces the burden and timelines for states, tribes, and territories to apply for the grant and for FEMA to then make award determinations. This is really focused on, this approach is developing an initial package with potential to ask for future modifications for additional funding if needed. So it really shortens the time frame from application to determination, because we're really just focusing on STTs gathering data to get services underway and then making additional modification asks later on once more accurate information, data, and decisions are made for the implementation of disaster case management. One example of this is for Kentucky, which the state of Kentucky did utilize the modern approach, and they received a disaster case management award within 40 days of the IA declaration. This was compared to 156 days to award a previous Kentucky disaster case management grant. Next slide. A third example of some of the efforts that we're doing to enhance our current programs using our existing authorities is evaluating ways that we can shorten the FEMA direct housing implementation overall. So we went through a process to review the entire direct housing process from start to finish, from assessment of the direct housing program through the lease-in of individuals into units, and then further to the end of the program and potential termination. As part of that effort, we evaluated ways that we can shorten the time frame to license individuals into units, evaluating ways that we can streamline some of those processes, and we're in process of implementing some of those recommendations from that process review effort. We also have worked with our logistics management directorate partners, and we are coordinating with them to award task orders for our direct housing mission planning contract faster, so that they can help support upfront the assessment for direct housing all the way through to developing the requirements for faster implementation. And then along those same lines, we are also working with our logistics management partners to award the task order for what we term Log House, which is our temporary housing unit haul and install contract, faster as well, based on the results of that mission planning contract and the assessment that's done. And then finally, as part of this effort, we also have established direct housing implementation teams. And I'll talk a little bit about these teams in more detail on the next slide. But essentially, these teams are made up of direct housing subject matter experts from the different offices that play a significant role in direct housing implementation, whether it's individual assistants, our logistics management directorate, our contracting and procurement staff, etc. So there's individuals identified who have the necessary experience and background and have attended various trainings that will deploy as a team to disasters with anticipated direct housing missions. And they'll establish the operational leadership for those direct housing operations. They'll work to establish the necessary staffing levels that may be needed if direct housing is implemented, and start the planning for the direct housing and implementation requirements. Based on a lot of these efforts, we have already started to see our direct housing implementation timeline be shortened. So for example, for Kentucky, disaster 4633, we started to see households being licensed into units in 16 days from the time they were determined eligible for direct housing. And in Florida, disaster 4673, we started seeing households licensed in within 22 days. Next slide. To get into the direct housing implementation team concept just a little bit further, as part of our effort to establish these teams, we were able to establish 2 direct housing implementation teams to fill these key management positions in anticipation of hurricane season. These are currently temporary teams. They are made up of various staff from across the agency. They're led by 2 of our federal coordinating officers from our field leadership division, and they're made up of full-time permanent staff from individual assistance, logistics management directorate, contracting, and external affairs. And based on the lessons learned of these teams for the deployments that occurred during the 2022 hurricane season, we will be evaluating creating permanent long-term teams moving forward. Next slide. And those are just some of the recommendations and the actions that we are taking for the step 2 of Direct Housing Reimagine, which, as I said, is evaluating what we can do under our current programs with our existing priorities for the direct housing program. But part of this effort from our strategic priorities and our strategic plan and the administrator's annual planning guidance was also to evaluate recommendations for bold and cross-cutting actions for a new strategy for housing, and in some cases, potentially new authorities. As part of this effort, we had a significant amount of recommendations that came from our stakeholder listening sessions. We went through and evaluated every recommendation that was received, and we essentially bucketed those into these 5 different groups. One was surrounding kind of funding the state, tribal, and territory housing capacity building. The second was establishing expanded sheltering authority and discontinuing the use of temporary housing. There was a lot of conversation in the stakeholder feedback sessions about and confusion on behalf of survivors of what's the difference between sheltering and temporary housing? Why is there a difference? If I'm provided a travel trailer, let's say under non-congregate sheltering, why then do I need to have a travel trailer under direct housing? So there was a lot of conversation and recommendations about why do we have 2 separate authorities? Can we reevaluate that? There was also conversation about establishing permanent grant programs for states, tribes, and territories to have the ability to provide housing, temporary housing, sheltering, direct housing to disaster survivors themselves. And looking at grant funding for permanent housing solutions in coordination with other federal agencies like SBA and HUD. And then finally, a lot of recommendations about how can we reduce the risk to housing resources in the future? How can we potentially utilize mitigation funding to help with reducing the risk overall? Next slide. So this slide just sets a foundation for some of those recommendations and that came out of Direct Housing Reimagine effort. So really with a focus on empowering states, tribes, and territories through permanent grants. So for planning and preparedness to include pre-event funding, direct sheltering services, and some permanent housing to disaster survivors, while ensuring equitable considerations and solutions and services and reducing the risk and building resilience. So a big focus of the recommendations, and a lot of the recommendations were, how can we provide funding incentives, whether through new grant programs, change of existing grant programs, to provide the ability for states, tribes, and territories to provide these direct services to disaster survivors. The second piece of this was, once we establish and empower STTs through that grant funding to provide those services, what is the role of FEMA and the federal government? So there were still lots of conversations and recommendations around FEMA still providing financial assistance to disaster survivors, and of course, these grants to STTs, identifying and working on ways that we can operationalize the recovery support function, especially the housing recovery support function, to coordinate the other federal agency housing funding like CDBG funding, and how does that correlate to these new potential grants provided to the states, tribes, and territories. And then lastly, a lot of recommendations on ensuring that we continue to empower the survivors to make these choices on their own as to how and which forms of assistance that they need, which ones will be the most equitable for them, and which ones will really help in their path to recovery. Next slide. As part of this entire effort, we will continue implementation of those current program improvements that I outlined, as well as some additional ones that were identified as part of this effort. We are working to establish a structure accountable for the implementation of the effort, and especially for the Direct Housing Step 3 Reimagine portion of this effort. We fully intend to continue to identify ways to socialize a lot of the recommendations that came out of this initiative, because we will need additional feedback from all of you on this phone call, et cetera, in order to inform what some of these grant programs might look like, what some of the additional authorities we maybe need to develop might look like in the future, to ensure that this is as effective as it possibly can be for both those who are implementing as well as for our disaster survivors. And I think, Jennifer, we will go to questions.
Great. Thanks, Blair. We do have a question. You mentioned pre-event funding. How would that work? What does that look like?
So right now, what
Blair, I believe you're on mute.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.
So I was just highlighting that right now, these are just recommendations, right? The next steps in this effort is to kind of do additional socialization and interaction so that we can take these concepts and recommendations and build them into actual proposals moving forward. But a lot of the recommendations that came through for the pre-event funding was identifying ways that we could establish grant funds that can be provided to states, tribes, and territories so that they can actually perform pre-event planning. They can do a lot of, establishing pre-event contracts so that they could be ready to actually implement the grants that are provided post-disaster.
Thank you. And kind of to follow on to that, how will, with regards to housing, current and future IA support functions coordinate with other FEMA programs that may be outside the Stafford Act? For example, the disaster in New Mexico.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to read that.
No worries.
So I can probably answer a little bit of a piece of this, but we are currently, there is a significant effort right now that we are working at FEMA in coordination with our HUD partners to do a lot of pre-event housing planning. So there is an effort currently underway where we are collaborating to support states, tribes, and territories develop pre-disaster housing plans. And this is all part of the housing recovery support function that is led by HUD in coordination with FEMA. And so we are looking to start this effort by working with a few states interested in developing some pre-disaster housing plans in 2023 to expedite overall housing and community recovery. So this is a very significant effort that we're really excited about. That's a focused effort into how we can utilize that housing recovery support function established under the National Disaster Recovery Framework to provide that direct support to some states, tribes, and territories to begin with to do this focused pre-disaster housing planning effort. More information will actually be coming out about this effort through our regional partners. So I really encourage you all to continue being interested in pre-disaster housing planning, because we know how important and effective it can be. And we will be providing more information about this effort and which states, tribes, or territories will be able to partner with to do some of these pre-disaster housing plans in 2023.
Great, thanks, Claire. I believe there's one more question about a housing pilot planning, but I think you've covered it and we'll continue to cover that in future symposiums as well. So at this time, we'll move back to Emily to introduce our next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am pleased to introduce Monty Lemaire, Branch Chief of FEMA's Individuals and Households Program, to discuss survivor experience. Monty, over to you.
Well, thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everybody. As Emily mentioned, my name is Monty Lemaire. I'm the Branch Chief of FEMA's Individual and Households Program. Anytime there's a declaration for individual assistance and you see 621 FEMA scrolling across the bottom of your local news channel, our branch is jumping into action to support survivors. So in addition to helping survivors register for assistance, we're also deploying staff to survivors' homes to verify disaster-related damages, deploying disaster survivor assistance teams to begin canvassing neighborhoods in the hardest hit areas, establishing a plan to open disaster recovery centers in impacted communities, and working with our regional, state, and local partners if there's a housing mission. Next slide, please. I packed a lot of information into this one slide, but I want to unpack that for you and kind of go through a few things. As Mr. Matranga mentioned at the start during the opening, just like many of you, FEMA is facing increased disaster activity with a workforce that is feeling fatigued of many years of heightened activity. In addition, we're trying to focus on customer experience and streamline that survivor journeys. So with an increased emphasis on equity and vulnerable communities, as Mr. Matranga mentioned, even more survivors need our assistance. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context to what we talk about when we talked about increased disaster activity. The Individual Assistance Division averages about 17 presidentially declared disasters per year. And as you can see on that first quadrant, a significant challenge to prepare for those active years that tend to happen more frequently. And as an example, as you can see on the spike in 2017, I think everybody probably realizes what that is. But that's, the IHP branch had about 20,000 team members supporting survivors who were impacted by Harvey, Irma, and Maria for that particular year. And if you go back over the last couple of years, 2021, we had Hurricane Ida, which was a 5-state event, Hurricane Fiona and Ian last year that severely impacted Puerto Rico and Florida. And we're already off to an active year with flooding in California and tornadoes in Alabama and Georgia. So as you can imagine, bringing on a significant number of staff during these disasters creates unique challenges for our survivors. Not only is our staff working a significant amount of overtime to meet survivor needs, but we're also straining the rest of the agency. And in some cases, other federal agencies, as we onboard a staff, when their time could probably be better used helping to serve survivors. And just as an example, in the past 10 years, we've registered about 12 million survivors for assistance. We've taken over 20 million phone calls from survivors in that same time period, and we've provided about $14 billion in IHP assistance. The quadrant at the bottom left is interesting to me. Survivors have an extremely diverse portfolio of the channels they can use to interact with all of us to get assistance. And I'm not sure any other federal agency or private sector company offers that kind of diversity in the channels their customers can leverage. And my assumption is if I added our state and local partners as well as our volunteer partners, this chart would probably double with the number of channels that a survivor can use. With that comes unique challenges, especially for underserved communities. And the increased risk of somebody falling through the safety net that we all created is actually a concern. To improve that experience, there's a lot of things that we're attempting to do. One is IHP is focused on simplifying the program. So there's really kind of a holistic approach to us looking at our programs and making sure that we can create information and give survivors the type of programs they need that are easy to navigate, that helps them get the type of assistance they need. One of our approaches is increasing our staff, and I'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute, but increasing the staff and their knowledge of our programs and becoming less dependent on just-in-time staffing solutions that are unable to provide the type of service that our survivors expect from us. And then one of the last things that we're trying to implement is really investing in empathetic technology to bring information to not only our survivors, but also to our staff in a simplified format, allowing them to become, force multipliers in disaster recovery. Next slide, please. So I added this slide here, but what we have noticed is just a significant shift in the disaster life cycle, with the emergence of smartphones and social media that you heard folks talk about earlier on in our presentation. Survivors have more information and capability at their fingertips than they've ever had before. And just to give you an example, about 70% of the total registrations we take now come via FEMA's mobile app or via the web, which is disasterassistance.gov. And the reason I shared this slide with you is because historically, we would be able to focus on registering survivors and handling those basic questions and or referrals. Now the questions and the needs are much more complex. The time frame for getting qualified and trained staff has been compressed. So it's very difficult for us to bring the average person off the street, fast track them through our training programs that generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual assistance to survivors. So one of the commitments the agency has made will essentially double the size of the IHP branch and processing center, enable us to handle most type 2 and type 3 disasters. It's essentially almost $100 million annual investment that the agency is making that we'll start implementing this year and that we'll implement and phase in over the next couple of years. But where the significant value comes from that is we're able to hire and train staff to handle the most complex survivor issues. It enables us to focus on vulnerable communities and survivors, and it will improve service and response times. We're also of the opinion that it will mitigate errors as well as reduce our overall, our overall operating costs. And cost is significantly more when we have to bring on external support, especially during these larger disasters. Next slide, please. The investment will also change the dynamics in the way we interface with survivors. The first slide and that lower quadrant that I just showed you with all the various channels a survivor can utilize, I think what this slide depicts in our current state is the challenges we have with having that type of diversity and some of the challenges or inconsistencies it can create for survivors along the way. What this particular current state shows you is that we have a relatively robust, capable digital environment when it comes to registrations, but I'm not quite as nimble as I need to be when it comes to staffing up our processing centers and field operations to handle those types of survivor needs. I think all of you are well aware the logistics alone of us deploying staff and getting them on the ground in the heavily impacted area takes time and effort, and that's can be a significant challenge. I think at our current state, which you also see is a really high level of program knowledge in our processing centers to help survivors navigate complex issues, but that still takes time for us to evolve. So we have an opportunity to improve the knowledge available via our digital channels and to better provide support for our staff in the field. And I think what this current state also talks about is just the scalability in the digital arena. It's actually fairly robust, but not so much in the processing centers. And moving staff downrange, as I just indicated, especially when we have multi-state events, could be a challenge. So as we start to pivot from current state, here are some of the things that we've done as we're starting to transition into future state. FEMA reservist trainees, as an example, have been working at the National Processing Service Centers. We have a very structured training program, and their ability to speak to survivors in our processing center, which offers a certain level of structure and discipline prior to them going down to the field, has proven to be very successful, and it's a practice that we'll continue to do. This helps us align services provided to survivors, regardless of how or where they engage, a FEMA staff member. As Blair mentioned earlier, enhanced applicant services. This further allows us to align the services provided to survivors and tailor program interactions with survivors based on their unique need. I think that's important. We had success in Kentucky, Illinois, and with some of our smaller disasters. We now need to continue to evolve our enhanced applicant services program that enables us to make sure it's scalable for our larger disasters. And this could, in my opinion, this could be game changing for underserved communities. So bottom line, we continue to work towards expanding the capabilities and services survivors can utilize for all of our various channels to make sure that we have a consistent look and feel, and whether you interface with us via the call center, online, or in the field, can our employees make sure that we're providing consistent level of service, handling issues, and taking care of survivors where they're at. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk a little bit about empathetic technology. Another thing that is evolving with survivors is the blurring of the line, so to speak, between live or in-person support and digital capabilities. We've already made the investment in live agent support, as I just mentioned before. We now need to do the same with empathetic technology. And for some of you who are wondering what empathetic technology is, it really is allowing us to adapt our digital capabilities to individual situations and state of mind. I think all of us on this particular phone have experienced the frustration of calling anywhere for service and getting stuck in press 1 for this, press 2 for that. Let me repeat my number, my account number. There are a lot of bad examples of things we don't want to put our survivors through. What we need to do with these digital platforms is have these tools say, thank you for calling FEMA, how can I help you? And either help you with what you need or efficiently get you to an agent if that is your preference. And I think what we've experienced is we have an entire generation of survivors that are completely comfortable using digital channels, and that is their preferred approach. And I don't know if this resonates with any of you on the phone. If it does, maybe drop something in the chat. But, I have college age kids that will sit in the same room with me and will text me and tell me, can you add money to my account? And I try to tell them, I'm right here. But I also need to keep in mind that that's our future workforce. They're going to be part of our community. They're going to be homeowners in the future, and they're completely comfortable taking care of business in that environment. I personally come from a generation where I continue to want to talk to you. I want to see you face to face. So the bottom line is we've got to be capable of evolving, the way that we interface with survivors in all arenas. But we're certainly, emphasizing those too. So I wanted to share with you just a few things we've done up to this point and things we're exploring to enhance the survivor's experience. When you call 621 FEMA, you'll come across FEMA's interactive voice response system. It's an IVR you probably experience with a lot of companies that you interface with when it comes to service. Some of the things we've done, we've actually re-recorded all the prompts to make that process easy to navigate. It isn't perfect, but it is much better than years past. And really what our objective is to make the ability for them, a survivor to navigate those systems and get to an applicant services agent, if that's their preference, in a timely manner. We've done the same for FEMA's COVID funeral line. Some of the things we've done when it comes to exploration of applicant-facing technology, as I mentioned earlier, we need to get out of the business of 1, 2, 3, press 1, 2, 3, and mitigate, 621 FEMA and migrate 621 FEMA to an intelligent virtual assistant and empathetic technology. We need to have more robust online system access and resources that empower survivors and educate them along the way during their path of recovery. So essentially what we want to do is evolve our tools, and we want to be able to meet them where they're at so they can engage in the approach, in the environment that's useful for them. One of the other things we've done and we're excited about is actually exploring the exploration of internal facing technology. And essentially what I'm talking about is bot technology. And believe it or not, there's tools and resources out there where we can essentially have a bot on an agent's shoulder that's listening to phone calls, it's interpreting what's taking place, and it's giving suggested texts or edits or guidance for our applicant services agents, in addition to the staff that I may have to bring in, which really kind of helps mitigate our concerns about potentially giving poor information to new hires. So we're excited about some of that technology that exists out there. And as we continue to migrate and get, a better understanding of how this can assist survivors, we're very excited about incorporating that kind of capability to interface with survivors. Knowledge bases to make sure that there's a consistent look and feel of the programs that we provide. Again, that way all FEMA staff can support survivors. So we're excited about some of the exploration that's being done right now and really how this could potentially change the way that we interface with survivors in the future. And then next slide, please. And then the last slide, really just to kind of sum things up, we want to be calibrated, irrespective of the channel a survivor chooses. Can we provide a consistent level of service? Can we solve problems? And can we meet their needs where they are at? Any high performing company does all of those really, really well. We want to continue to simplify the service and the programs that we offer to help survivors navigate their recovery efforts. I'm not sure our programs or tools will ever be as intuitive as something like TurboTax, but streamlining the registration process, reducing the survivor's burden, improving our communications with survivors, improving transparency so that survivors know where they're at in the process at all times. Those are all priorities for us as we move into 2023. And I think the last thing here I wanted to mention is that we want to be accessible. And you've heard me say this a couple of times throughout my presentations, that we want survivors to be able to do business on their time and when it's convenient for them. You want to speak to an agent, great. We'll have highly trained agents capable of generating an outcome for you. You prefer to use digital capabilities, great. Feel free to register and track your progress online. You prefer to speak to someone in person at one of our disaster recovery centers or a town hall. Staff are now trained and have tools at their fingertips to resolve an issue instead of referring them to centralized processing centers. So that's what the next generation of IEP looks like. We're very excited about the investment the agency's made in our staffing. We certainly look forward to continuing to evolve the rest of that strategy. But I do want to thank all of you today, and I appreciate your time. And thank you for allowing me to present to you on progress we're making to improve survivor experience at FEMA. So that's it from me. I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, I'm happy to send it back to Emily.
Thanks, Monty. Appreciate your presentation. And we did get some comments regarding how to receive assistance and then how to appeal assistance to prevent duplication. We also received some comments about meeting the needs of not only the younger survivors, but the older survivors, particularly in Florida, who may not be as technologically savvy as the younger survivors. So those are things I think we'll address in future presentations and as we continue to improve the survivor experience. I'll wait a few more minutes to see if there are other questions coming in. I'm reading some of them now.
Sure. Hey, Jennifer, sure. While you're looking, I mean, I certainly would like to address a couple of those. And we recognize, this digital generation. And as I indicated, I come from a generation where we're happy to pick up the phone and talk to you or see you in person. And so we recognize that there's still a significant population of survivors out there that, need to be, staff on the ground. That's the reason why, we're excited about modernizing our DRCs, where you can not only enhance the way that you can interface with a FEMA employee face-to-face, but also enhancing the digital capabilities. I think we acknowledge and recognize that by our enhanced applicant services approach. I think all of us realize that even, us that have to navigate our own disasters, whether it's an insurance claim or whatever, there's opportunities for us to reach out and make sure that we're explaining our programs. We're making sure we're dotting all the I's and crossing the T's. We're helping them fill gaps. So we certainly acknowledge that, digital is the future, but there's a lot that we can continue to do to help, survivors that still need to make sure that FEMA has a presence on the ground and face-to-face.
And that also extends to language interpretation, that are there discussions to increase the availability of language access services for those whose English is not their primary language?
Yeah, and then that is that's a great question, and there's a wonderful opportunity for us. I mean, just to put a little bit of that into context, I mean, right now, without this past year being a little bit of an outlier, that that roughly 95% of our inbound activity is English speaking, right? So obviously we have that capability there, but that 5% of the population that needs to communicate with us in other languages, there certainly is opportunity for us to continue to evolve and grow those capabilities. Right now, we are capable of answering over 90 different languages utilizing our interpreter services. That's not always the most efficient way to communicate, with survivors, but we are certainly continuing to invest in our bilingual capability, more specifically Spanish speaking. So, there is opportunity out there for us to continue to work on interpreter services and continuing to grow that capability. But, that's a point well taken and something that certainly is a priority for us. So I appreciate that comment.
And there's a question that came in from New Mexico about collaborating with other states, and just want to let you know that you can reach out to your regional POC. If you don't know who that regional POC is, the Office of Regional Field Coordination, which will have our email up shortly, will be able to get you that information. I believe, I think there's one more question here. Being that SBA is an integral part of the IHP process, are there similar conversations, upgrades, survivor experience conversations taking place with them so assistance is not progressing in one aspect but delayed in others? So I know, I don't know if Frank is still on or Zach is still on to answer the SBA collaboration question.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, a couple thoughts from me. So FEMA collaborates closely with the Small Business Administration on a number of service delivery mechanisms. Most folks are familiar that when a disaster recovery center opens up, SBA is almost always co-located along with that, and sometimes continues operating even out of that same facility after FEMA departs. In some cases, I've seen SBA with some proactive technologies that I think we'd like to see FEMA adopt in terms of dual monitors and some other capabilities in disaster recovery centers. SBA also collaborates with FEMA on disasterassistance.gov, which is the entry portal for federal disaster resources. It's delivered through a partnership across multiple federal agencies. And then more on the internal side, there's work that takes place to exchange data in between FEMA and the Small Business Administration from a data sharing perspective because of dependencies between the two agencies' authorities related to what can be provided, what can be compensated, and the sequence of delivery that's necessary. So, I guess in summary, I would say we are in close coordination with the Small Business Administration while also identifying through initiatives like what Blair briefed earlier in terms of Direct Housing Reimagined, where there are potential efficiencies, some of which might require legislative or statutory change in terms of the way the programs interact with each other. But certainly on the FEMA side, and I think on the SBA side as well, there's an appetite to look at those things, and we continue that dialogue. I'll pause and see if anyone has from headquarters has anything additional they want to add to that. No, back over to you, Jennifer. Thanks.
Thanks, Zach. Just reading our next question, and along those lines of data sharing, is there survivor information shared with the states for tracking data and collection in real time as well? So I guess that survivors directly contacting and registering with FEMA, is that survivor information shared with the states for tracking data?
So I'll speak a little bit to it. Liz may want to add. Upon request and after a adjudication process back and forth between FEMA and the state, yes, that information can be shared. No, it is not in real time.
That's
I'll
it.
leave it at that.
You're good.
Thanks to you both. And for right now, that is all of the questions that I have. And so I will just offer this time to any of our presenters for any last comments before we close out today's IA Symposium. All right, well, thank you all very much. On your screen, you will see a pop-up of a few questions and also a question in the chat. If you would like to, we welcome you to participate. These questions give us some idea of how well we're doing in the sense of what you all want to see moving forward as we continue these virtual IA Symposiums. If you have any questions regarding anything you've seen today or anything regarding IA programs, please send those questions to FEMA-HQ-field-coordination@fema.dhs.gov, as you can see on the screen. So we'll keep the feedback form up for a few more minutes, but this concludes today's virtual IA Symposium, and I thank you all for your participation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.